Dylan Millard and Mark Smith found guilty of first-degree murder of Laura Babcock. That, again, coming from Trevor Dunn of CBC News, who is in the courtroom right now. Breaking news that these two, who had been charged with first-degree murder of 23-year-old Laura Babcock, who had not been seen.
Don't expect to ever see her again. Those words would later become one of the most discussed statements connected to this investigation. But when they were first spoken, they didn't immediately change the direction of the case. At that moment, there wasn't a major criminal investigation. There wasn't a nationwide search. There wasn't even a suspect. There was only one question. Where was Laura Babcock? She was 23 years old. She had a family who expected to hear from her. Friends who knew her routines. People who believed that, sooner or later, she would answer her phone. She never did. As the days passed, investigators worked with the information they had. There was nothing at that stage that clearly pointed them toward what this case would eventually become. The early assumption was straightforward. Laura might have decided to leave on her own. Then something happened. Not all at once. One document, then another. A phone record, a text message, a receipt, a digital photograph. Each one looked ordinary by itself. Together, they started pointing in the same direction. And that direction led investigators to someone they already knew by name. Dylan Millard. At first glance, his connection to Laura didn't appear unusual. They had known each other for years. That alone wasn't enough to explain why her communication suddenly stopped. But investigators weren't relying on assumptions anymore. They were relying on evidence. As more records were collected, a timeline slowly came into focus. Every verified detail filled another gap. Every discovery answered one question while raising another. Months later, that search would extend beyond Toronto to a rural property outside Waterloo, where investigators would make a discovery that transformed the entire investigation. To understand why that location became so important, we have to go back to the beginning, before Laura disappeared, before investigators connected the evidence, and before anyone realized this case would become one of Canada's most closely examined criminal investigations. July 2012. Every investigation begins somewhere. Sometimes it begins with a witness. Sometimes with physical evidence. This one began with silence. Laura Babcock was 23 years old and living in Toronto. Life hadn't been easy. She had been dealing with financial pressure and moving between temporary places to stay while trying to get back on stable ground. Even so, there were people who expected to hear from her. Then, they didn't. On July 3, 2012, Laura's cell phone stopped connecting to the network. Calls stopped. Messages stopped. Days passed without anyone hearing directly from her. At first, there wasn't enough information to explain why. Her family knew something wasn't right. On July 14th, they officially reported her missing to Toronto police. From an investigative standpoint, detectives could only work with the facts available at that moment. Laura was an adult. There was no verified witness reporting that she had been taken against her will. There was no confirmed location showing where she had gone after her last known communications. Because of that, investigators considered a possibility that is common in many adult missing person cases, that she may have chosen to leave voluntarily. Looking only at the information available in July 2012, that assessment was understandable. But as this investigation would later show, first impressions do not always reflect the full picture. While investigators reviewed Laura's recent contacts, one familiar name appeared among the records: Dylan Millard. The two had known each other for several years and had remained in contact. At that stage, those communications did not establish wrongdoing. They simply identified someone connected to Laura's final known days. Another name would also become important: Mark Smith. In July 2012, neither man had become the focus of a major public investigation connected to Laura's disappearance. Nothing suggested that this case would later reshape how investigators looked at the evidence. From the outside, it appeared to be a missing person investigation with very few immediate answers. But investigations are rarely solved by first impressions. They're solved by facts. And in this case, the facts were only beginning to surface. Before investigators could understand the evidence, they first had to understand the people. Because this investigation didn't begin with strangers whose paths crossed by chance. It began with two lives that looked completely different on paper, yet had already become connected years earlier. If you enjoy fact-based true crime documentaries built from verified court records, investigative files, and publicly available evidence, consider subscribing. Every case on this channel is researched to separate confirmed facts from speculation, allowing you to follow the investigation exactly as it developed. Let's begin with Laura Babcock. Laura grew up in Ontario with her parents, Clayton and Linda Babcock, and her older brother, Brent. Those who knew her described her as bright, creative, and someone who enjoyed writing, literature, and performing arts. Education mattered to her, which is why she enrolled at the University of Toronto, where she studied English literature and theater. Outside the classroom, Laura worked part-time at a toy store. Like many students, she was trying to balance school, work, and everyday expenses. But over time, those expenses became harder to manage. Her income wasn't enough to cover rent consistently, and stable housing became increasingly difficult to maintain. Court records also show that Laura received psychiatric care during this period of her life. Investigators reviewed those records because they helped establish an accurate timeline of her circumstances. They did not explain why she disappeared, nor did they change the concerns of the people who knew her best. One of those people was Sean Lerner. Sean had previously been in a relationship with Laura. Although they eventually went their separate ways, they remained on good terms. Friends and court testimony described Sean as someone who continued to support her whenever she faced difficult situations. Whether she needed practical help or someone willing to listen, Sean stayed in her life long after their relationship had ended. Now consider someone whose life followed a very different path. Dellen Millard was the only son of Wayne Millard, whose family owned Millard Air, a long-established aviation company based near Waterloo, Ontario. Growing up around the family business meant Dellen had access to aircraft, hangars, luxury vehicles, and several properties connected to the family's operations. Financial pressure was not a challenge he appeared to face in the same way many people his age did. To friends and acquaintances, Dellen projected the image of someone who enjoyed an active social life and significant freedom. During this period, he was also in a relationship with Christina Nudga, often identified in court proceedings as Christina. Witnesses would later describe that relationship as becoming increasingly serious, even while Dellen remained in contact with people from earlier stages of his life. On paper, Laura Babcock and Dellen Millard seemed to have very little in common. One was working to regain stability while navigating financial uncertainty. The other had grown up surrounded by opportunity and resources. Yet documents, witness statements, and later court proceedings would show that their connection had never completely ended. And understanding how that connection continued would become one of the first steps in understanding everything that followed. To understand what happened next, you first have to understand the relationships, not the rumors, not the headlines, the relationships supported by witness testimony, phone records, and evidence presented in court. The story begins in 2009. That was the year Laura Babcock and Dellen Millard met at a neighborhood pub in Toronto. Their lives looked very different. Laura was building her future through school and work. Dellen came from a family known for its aviation business. Even with those differences, they started dating. For a period of time, the relationship appeared ordinary. Eventually, it came to an end. According to witnesses who knew both of them, the breakup was not followed by a complete separation. Instead, they stayed in contact. They occasionally spoke, exchanged messages, and saw each other from time to time without returning to a committed relationship. At that stage, no one considered that unusual. Former partners sometimes remain friends. Nothing about that fact alone suggested that it would later become important. Then, in the summer of 2010, another relationship began. Laura met Sean Lerner. Witnesses described Sean as someone who brought stability into her life. Their relationship developed naturally and continued for more than a year. When they eventually separated around Christmas 2011, The relationship ended respectfully. But the connection remained. Court testimony later showed that Sean continued supporting Laura after the breakup. He stayed in contact, checked on her, and remained one of the people she trusted during difficult periods. While Laura's life was changing, so was Dellen's. He had begun a serious relationship with Christina Nudga, also identified in court records as Christina. As that relationship became more serious, one issue continued to surface. Laura. Multiple witnesses later told investigators that Christina knew Dellen and Laura still communicated from time to time. According to those statements, that continued contact became a source of growing tension. Then came February 26, 2012, a date that would later receive close attention during the investigation. On Laura's birthday, Christina sent her a text message. The message read, "Happy birthday. Exactly 1 year ago today, I slept with Dellen for the first time." Laura replied soon afterward, "Good for you. I was with him a couple of weeks ago." The exchange was brief, only a few sentences, but according to the evidence, it quickly reached Dellen. He then sent Laura a message asking her not to contact him anymore. Court records show that he told her she had become a problem in his personal life. For a short time, everything appeared to settle down. There were no public confrontations. No reports of arguments involving all four people together. Life simply continued. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. Behind the scenes, however, the relationships had become more complicated than they had ever been before. Laura remained connected to Dellen. Sean remained concerned about Laura. Christina wanted certainty about her relationship with Dellen. And Dellen stood at the center of those overlapping relationships. As spring turned into summer, the conversations continued, the personal history remained, and the distance between these four lives became smaller with each passing week. By the time July 2012 arrived, those connections would become impossible for investigators to ignore. By the final week of June 2012, Laura Babcock was running out of options. Finding a permanent place to live had become more difficult than she expected. Her previous apartment was no longer available to her, and every day began with the same question. Where would she stay next? Court records and witness testimony show that Laura spent those days making calls, sending messages, checking rental listings, and reaching out to people she believed might be able to help. She wasn't disappearing from people's lives. She was actively trying to rebuild stability. One of the people who continued helping her was Sean Lerner. Although their relationship had ended months earlier, Sean never completely stepped away. Friends and testimony presented during the trial described him as someone who continued checking on Laura and offering practical support whenever he could. As Laura's housing situation became more urgent, Sean paid for a hotel room on Toronto's west side so she would have somewhere to stay while searching for a more permanent home. He also purchased an iPad for her. That device would later become an important piece of evidence. At the time, however, it served a simple purpose. Laura used it to search apartment listings, communicate with friends, respond to emails, and organize her search for housing. Investigators later confirmed that the tablet became part of her daily routine during those final days. For a brief period, things appeared to be improving. Then circumstances changed again. Toronto was preparing for several major summer events, bringing thousands of visitors into the city. Hotels quickly reached capacity, vacancies became scarce, and extending temporary accommodation became increasingly difficult. Laura was once again searching for somewhere to stay. As those pressures grew, investigators confirmed that communication continued between Laura and Dellen Millard. Phone records later examined during the investigation showed multiple contacts between them during the closing days of June and the beginning of July. The records confirmed when communication occurred. They did not reveal every word that was spoken. That missing context would become one of the many questions investigators later tried to answer. As July 3, 2012, began, Laura was still making plans. Digital evidence showed that her cell phone remained active throughout part of the day. Each connection to a nearby cellular tower created another verified timestamp, allowing investigators to reconstruct her movements with increasing accuracy. The records placed her phone in Toronto's West End. Those digital records became especially important because they relied on network data rather than memory. Witnesses may remember events differently over time. Technology records events as they happen. Investigators later compared Laura's cell phone activity with other digital evidence collected during the case. Every confirmed connection helped narrow the timeline. Every recorded call helped establish another verified point. Then, the pattern changed. On July 3, 2012, Laura's cell phone made its final confirmed connection to the cellular network. After that, no additional calls were recorded. No further network connections were detected. No new digital activity linked to her cell phone was identified by investigators. At the time, no one realized how important that final signal would become. But as the investigation expanded months later, detectives repeatedly returned to that exact moment. Because the last confirmed activity from Laura's phone marked the final independently verified point in her known timeline. And from there, the search for answers would depend almost entirely on the digital evidence left behind. Days passed, then another week. For Laura Babcock's family, the silence no longer felt normal. Laura had faced difficult periods before, but she usually stayed in touch with the people closest to her. Even a short message was enough to let them know she was okay. This time, nothing came. On July 14, 2012, Clayton and Linda Babcock officially reported their 23-year-old daughter missing to the Toronto Police Service. Detectives began with the facts they had available that day. Laura was an adult. She had recently experienced financial hardship. She had moved between temporary places to stay. She had previously made independent decisions without always informing family members immediately. Based on those known circumstances, investigators initially considered the possibility that Laura had chosen to leave on her own. At that point, there was no confirmed evidence showing exactly what had happened. No verified witness had reported seeing a crime. No physical evidence had yet pointed investigators in another direction. Those early facts shaped the first stage of the investigation. As a result, the case moved at a slower pace than Laura's family had hoped. While investigators continued reviewing available information, someone else had already started asking his own questions. Sean Lerner. The longer Laura remained silent, the more concerned he became. He knew her well enough to recognize that something felt different. Instead of waiting for answers, Sean began looking through information that was already available. When Laura's family received another monthly cell phone bill, the records showed a number that appeared repeatedly during the days before communication stopped. The number belonged to Delon Millard. Rather than making assumptions, Sean decided to speak with Delon directly. He contacted him and arranged to meet. The meeting took place at a Starbucks in Toronto. Sean later described the conversation to investigators. He asked one direct question. Did Delon know where Laura was? According to Sean's statement, Delon said Laura had recently contacted him while asking for access to prohibited substances. Then came another comment that stayed with Sean long after the meeting ended. According to the statement later presented during the investigation, Delon told him not to expect Laura to return. Sean didn't dismiss the conversation. He didn't wait to see what might happen next. He went directly to investigators and repeated everything he could remember. He also explained why the repeated phone contact between Laura and Delon deserved closer attention. Investigators documented the information. They compared Sean's account with the facts already available. At that stage, however, the evidence still did not establish exactly what had happened to Laura. Without additional confirmed information, the original assessment remained largely unchanged. The investigation stayed open, but it did not accelerate. Looking back through court records, it becomes clear that those first decisions influenced the pace of the case during its earliest months. Not because investigators knew what would later come to light, but because they were working with the information they had at the time. Months later, as new evidence began to emerge, detectives returned to those early phone records. They reviewed Sean's statement again. They revisited the Starbucks meeting, and details that once appeared routine would eventually take on a very different meaning. For months, Laura Babcock's disappearance remained exactly where it had started. Open, unresolved, and moving very slowly. There were no confirmed sightings, no verified communication, no new evidence strong enough to change the direction of the investigation. Then, an entirely different case changed everything. On May 6, 2013, 32-year-old Tim Bosma left his home in Hamilton, Ontario, after arranging to meet two prospective buyers interested in purchasing his pickup truck. When he failed to return, investigators launched a large-scale investigation. Detectives gathered surveillance footage, reviewed telephone records, interviewed witnesses, followed vehicle movements, and carefully compared every verified piece of evidence. As the investigation progressed, one name appeared repeatedly: Delon Millard. Soon afterward, investigators arrested Delon in connection with the Bosma investigation. His close associate, Mark Smich, was also taken into custody. Those arrests allowed investigators to apply for additional search warrants connected to properties linked to both men. One location immediately attracted attention. It was a rural property near Waterloo, Ontario. Police officers, forensic specialists, and evidence teams searched the farm methodically. The property included barns, equipment sheds, open fields, and several structures that investigators documented one by one. During that search, investigators examined a large industrial incinerator located on the property. Court records later established that Delon had privately purchased the equipment and referred to it by the nickname, the Eliminator. Because the equipment was considered relevant to the search warrant, forensic specialists documented it carefully as part of the broader investigation. The search continued. Every building, every storage area, every item authorized under the warrant. As investigators expanded their work beyond the farm, another search warrant was executed months later at a residence connected to Mark Smich. This search produced evidence that immediately stood out. Investigators recovered an Apple iPad. By checking the serial number, detectives confirmed that it was the same device Sean Lerner had purchased for Laura Babcock while she was searching for permanent housing during the summer of 2012. A second discovery followed. Investigators also located a red travel bag with Laura's name written on its luggage tag. According to evidence later presented in court, handwriting analysis supported that the writing matched Laura's own handwriting. Those discoveries immediately changed the way investigators viewed her disappearance. Until then, the investigation had been guided largely by the possibility that Laura had left voluntarily. Now, personal property connected directly to Laura had been recovered from a location associated with one of the men already under investigation in another major case. Detectives continued interviewing people connected to both suspects. Several witnesses provided statements about conversations they remembered from 2012. Investigators documented each statement carefully before comparing them with cell phone records, digital evidence, search warrant findings, and the timeline they had been building piece by piece. No single discovery answered every question. Instead, each verified fact supported another: the recovered iPad, the travel bag, the witness statements, the search warrant evidence. Together, they formed a picture that investigators could no longer ignore. Laura Babcock's file was no longer treated solely as a missing person investigation. It became the focus of a full criminal investigation. From that point forward, detectives shifted their attention to something that could not forget: the digital evidence. Every phone call, every cell phone connection, every text message, every electronic device. Because unlike memories, digital records preserve their own timeline, and investigators were about to discover that the timeline told a story no witness could have reconstructed on their own. For months, investigators had questions, but very few answers. Laura Babcock had disappeared without a confirmed sighting, without any verified contact, and without any activity that suggested she had started a new life. The turning point came when investigators stopped looking at the case as a missing person file and started rebuilding every hour of Laura's final known days. One record at a time, one device at a time, one message at a time. Cell phone records became one of the first major pieces of the investigation. By comparing connection logs with nearby cell towers, investigators established the locations where Laura's phone had connected during its final period of activity. Those records helped narrow the timeline and confirmed that her phone remained active for only a limited time before disappearing from the network completely. That sudden silence mattered, because after that point, there were no verified calls, no new text messages, and no evidence that Laura had used her phone again. Investigators then examined thousands of text messages exchanged between Laura and Dylan Millard over several months. The conversations showed that despite ending their relationship, they had continued communicating regularly. Some messages discussed meeting in person. Others focused on housing, personal matters, and future plans. Instead of relying on assumptions, investigators compared those messages with phone records, witness statements, and known movements. When the information was placed side by side, a consistent timeline began to emerge. Search warrants also gave investigators access to digital devices connected to the case. Computers, mobile devices, and online accounts were examined by forensic specialists. Deleted material, account activity, and stored data were carefully reviewed. Even when information had been removed by users, forensic techniques were sometimes able to determine when files had existed, when devices had been used, and how accounts had been accessed. Photographs recovered during the investigation also became important. Digital image files often contain hidden metadata. That information can include the date a photo was created, the device used to capture it, and, in some cases, location information. Investigators compared those records with other digital evidence to verify timelines rather than relying on memory alone. Financial records added another layer. Bank transactions, purchases, and account activity helped investigators establish where certain individuals had been during key periods. Those records were never treated as proof by themselves. Instead, they were compared with every other source of evidence. Piece by piece, investigators built a timeline supported by independent records. Internet activity was also examined after search warrants were approved. Browser history and account usage were analyzed alongside phone data and witness interviews. No single record solved the case. It was the combination of digital evidence, physical evidence, and witness testimony that allowed investigators to understand what had happened. By the time the investigation reached that stage, the unanswered questions that had existed for months were being replaced with documented evidence. The case was no longer built on theories. It was being built on records, timelines, forensic analysis, and facts that could be presented in court. If you enjoy true crime documentaries that explain how investigators piece together evidence instead of only revealing the final outcome, subscribe now. Every case on this channel is researched through verified records, court proceedings, and investigative findings, so you can follow the evidence from beginning to end. By the time the case reached court, investigators had already spent years assembling thousands of records, witness statements, digital evidence, and forensic findings. The question before the jury was no longer whether Laura Babcock had disappeared. The question was whether the evidence proved that her disappearance was the result of a planned criminal act, and whether Dylan Millard and Mark Smich were responsible. Both men stood trial on charges of first-degree murder. From the opening statements, prosecutors acknowledged what everyone in the courtroom already knew. Laura had never been found. Rather than relying on one decisive piece of evidence, the Crown explained that the case would be built from many verified facts that, when examined together, formed one consistent timeline. Jurors were shown records documenting Laura's final communications, the sudden end of her digital activity, and the investigation that followed. They also heard testimony explaining how search warrants, recovered personal belongings, electronic records, and witness accounts connected events that had once appeared unrelated. The prosecution argued that each piece of evidence supported the next. Phone records matched witness statements. Digital records matched the timeline investigators had reconstructed. Property recovered during the investigation matched information already known to police. Instead of asking the jury to rely on assumptions, prosecutors encouraged them to consider how every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. The defense presented a different view. Defense lawyers argued that the case relied on circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. They reminded jurors that Laura's remains had never been recovered and maintained that alternative explanations should still be considered before reaching a verdict. Over several weeks, investigators, forensic specialists, digital analysts, and civilian witnesses testified under oath. Each answered detailed questions from both the prosecution and the defense. Their testimony gave jurors the opportunity to evaluate not only the evidence itself, but also how it had been collected, analyzed, and verified throughout the investigation. Once both sides finished presenting their cases, the judge instructed the jury on the law and explained the standard they were required to apply. The jurors then began their deliberations, carefully reviewing the evidence that had been presented throughout the trial. In June 2017, they returned with their decision. Dellen Millard and Mark Smich were each found guilty of first-degree murder in Laura Babcock's case. The jury concluded that the combined weight of the evidence proved the charge beyond a reasonable doubt, even though Laura herself was never recovered. Under Canadian law, both men received the mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without eligibility for parole for 25 years. The verdict closed one chapter of the investigation, but it also demonstrated an important point. A criminal case does not always depend on a single discovery. Sometimes, the truth is established because hundreds of verified facts, examined together, leave no reasonable explanation other than the one presented in court. The jury had reached its decision, but the legal process was not yet over. As expected in a case of this scale, both Dellen Millard and Mark Smich exercised their right to appeal their convictions. Their legal teams argued that the trial should be reviewed, asking higher courts to examine both the evidence and the proceedings. After carefully reviewing the record, the appellate courts found no reason to overturn the verdicts. The convictions remained in place, and both men continued serving life sentences under Canadian law, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years for Laura Babcock's murder. For Laura's family, however, the conclusion of the trial did not erase years of uncertainty. Throughout the investigation, Clayton Babcock, Linda Babcock, and Brent Babcock continued speaking publicly about Laura and worked to ensure that her disappearance would never be forgotten. Their determination kept attention on the case during long periods when there appeared to be few answers. Even after the verdict, they continued to remember Laura not for the investigation that followed, but for the life she lived before everything changed. The investigation also left a lasting mark on law enforcement across Canada. In its early stages, Laura's disappearance was viewed as the possible choice of an adult who had decided to leave on her own. As more evidence came to light, investigators demonstrated how quickly an early assumption can influence the direction of a missing person investigation. The case has since become an important example of why every report deserves careful review and why new information should always be examined, even years later. Another lasting lesson came from the role of technology. Phone records, text messages, metadata, financial transactions, internet activity, recovered electronic devices, and witness statements each provided one part of the timeline. None of those records answered every question on their own. Together, they allowed investigators to reconstruct events with a level of detail that would have been difficult only a generation earlier. The case is now frequently referenced when discussing the growing importance of digital evidence in modern criminal investigations. When this documentary began, the question seemed almost impossible to answer. How could a young woman disappear from one of Canada's largest cities without immediate answers? The truth did not emerge through a confession or one dramatic discovery. It came from years of careful investigative work, patient analysis, verified evidence, and people who refused to stop asking questions. That is why Laura Babcock's case continues to matter today. It reminds us that every missing person report represents real life, a real family, and real people waiting for answers. It also shows that even when time appears to erase a trail, facts have a way of resurfacing. Sometimes justice arrives slowly, but when investigators follow the evidence wherever it leads, the truth has a chance to be heard.